So hi, my name is Jamel Buhari, and I'm a PhD candidate at Leiden University. And in my current research project, I focus on queer African migrants in the Netherlands. And this research is part of the Ithaca project. And in this MOOC, I'll be talking about oral history, which is a research method I also make use of in my own current research. And in this MOOC, I'll reflect a bit on my own experiences doing oral history research, but also teaching oral history to university students. And I will share some tips that will help you in conducting oral history in an ethical and inclusive way, particularly when studying themes related to migration or migration histories and working with people with a migration experience. So today I'll start by quickly introducing the method. I'll zoom in on the value of oral history research and touch upon the many ways in which it can enrich our understanding of historical events. And I'll also zoom in on some challenges that come with this method, which entails a wide range of ethical dilemmas one needs to be aware of when conducting oral history research. It's a method in which you as a researcher deal with highly personal narratives. So this requires a great deal of sensitivity throughout the different stages of the research process. So what exactly is oral history research? So oral history is a qualitative research method. It's a form of an in-depth interview, usually taking place in a semi-structured interviewing format. And historians would often make use of this method as a way to capture a personal recollection on certain historical events, or to get more insights on life in a particular historical period. And it's therefore a useful way to add to the existing historical sources, or perhaps fill in gaps, or challenge more hegemonic ways of remembering, particularly when those that witness certain historical events are still alive. Collecting these first-hand testimonies can be of great value when trying to understand this past, but also the present. And of course, as a researcher, you take this a step further. So it's not just the interview, but it's also the steps after conducting the interview, which of course entails making a transcript in the case an audio recording has been made, but also analyzing this narrative and drawing conclusions. And here, of course, it's important to critically look at the role of memory. Of course, our personal narratives are very selective, and what and how we remember certain things and what we choose to share all relates to our identity, how we self-identify, but also how we wish to present ourselves to the outside world. But again, this is also influenced by our surroundings, by our cultural background, perhaps societal norms, values, or more dominant forms of knowledge and ways of remembering. And this has also been referred to in what you can see here on the slide as collective memories. So as a researcher and also analyzing the narratives that come out of your oral history research, it's important to look at this relationship between the personal but also the collective, and how these two perhaps are always fluid, and one can also influence the other. And just to give a bit more background on the oral history method, it's a method that has been, or came up more recently, you could say, so more in the second half of the 20th century, which also relates to the development of audio recording equipment. And it's only from the late 20th century that the method became more widely accepted in academia. But it's also a method that continues to get lots of criticism, and it's often claimed to be, or dismissed by perhaps some more traditional scholars, to be too subjective, or it's criticized as being unreliable, also criticizing the unreliability perhaps of personal memory. But I would argue, however, that oral history is a very valuable method, and I'll expand on that later. But I would argue, just to sort of respond to this criticism on the method perhaps being too subjective, that of course all research is subjective to a certain extent. And yes, oral history relies on highly subjective personal narratives. However, all history is written from a certain perspective on the past. And in the case of oral history, it is of course a personal view of the past, but it can also give us rich insights into how people lived in a certain time period, similar to other individual expressions about the past, such as biographies, photos, film, or other sources that you can think of. So I think oral history can be of great value in understanding the past. It really adds sort of personal experience to these more dominant historical accounts, and by highlighting a multitude of voices, you can add more nuance and also challenge these hegemonic understandings of past and present. And especially in combination with other types of sources, it allows for a more complete understanding of the complexities that make up human lives and our lived realities. And also in cases where certain voices are perhaps largely invisible or absent in, for example, some archives and are not part of these more dominant narratives. And this brings me to why oral history is so important when studying migration. I myself study migration as part of my research project. And why do I think this method is so important when studying migrations? Well, migration, of course, is a highly politicized topic, and it has looking at sort of political debates, but also media debates, there has often been this focus on numbers and lots of sort of predictions of future numbers of potential migrants arriving, which often contributes to this negative framing or problematizing frames of migrants, sort of framed as a threat to societies. And I think as a researcher, it's therefore very important to counter such narratives and to also provide more space to migrant perspectives. So using this method can be a way to shed light on a multitude of perspectives, but also personal experiences from a migrant point of view, and move beyond these often problematizing and simplified single narratives. So as a researcher here, I think it's very important to be conscious of the voices that we highlight. So being critical of the people you work with and what they might represent. And I would therefore recommend to use a multitude of voices and perspectives in your study, particularly when dealing with migrant narratives, to not present or reproduce this sort of simplistic, one-sided narrative. So in that sense, it's also very important to be aware of potential generalization so that you don't contribute to this reproduction of this single story, particularly when working with people or communities that who are already faced with these single or one-sided narratives about their communities, which of course is often the case with different migrant communities, but you can also think of other communities that are marginalized by society. So here as a researcher, I think it's very important to be aware also of the context that you're in. For example, I work mainly in the Netherlands, which of course is a country with a colonial history, which has a legacy, of course, but also a society in which there has been, but continues to be a large anti-migrant sentiment, xenophobia, or different ways in which groups are being problematized in society. So in that sense, it's very important to be careful and conscious of which voices you amplify and how you represent certain narratives, especially because you wouldn't want your research to contribute to further stigmatization of certain communities, and of course not damage the communities that you work with. And this brings me to some challenges that have also come with the oral history method. And here I will reflect on my own work and some experience that I've had in doing oral history research, but also some things I've noticed amongst my students working with this method. And you can probably think of many more challenges. Today I'll just highlight 3 and also come up with some ways to deal with these challenges. But of course, as a researcher, it's good to be flexible and also be aware of potential unexpected challenges that might come up, or dilemmas that might come up during the research process. So challenge 1 relates to which might be one of the most important challenge, is protecting the safety of respondents. So of course your research could negatively impact the safety or the lives of your narrators. So yeah, it's important to be aware of the potential dangers or the risks of the study on the life of the people you work with, and also be conscious of ways in which it might impact their lives. Yeah, and perhaps also in cases where you're dealing with people with uncertain migratory statuses, what would be the impact if this story is out there to the public? So of course there's different ways to deal with this, and also reflect a bit on my own experience. So one, I think it's very important to be transparent, so transparency throughout the research process. be clear about your intentions, your purpose of the research, and also make clear agreements with your respondents, what are their expectations, and also as a way to sort of prevent false expectations or misunderstandings, and also be very transparent about where would it be published. And this also relates to, which I already mentioned, clear agreements. So agreements about anonymization, which of course seems very obvious, but it's very important. It needs careful consideration. And depending on the topic, of course, whether someone's name might be attached to a certain narrative can have serious consequences if not dealt with carefully. And of course, there are certain formal requirements that will help you, and ethical guidelines that might help you in this process. And challenge 2 that I would like to highlight, which again also relates to my own work, but I've also seen others reflecting on this, which relates to the topic of positionality. So the positionality of you as a researcher and how this might impact the study. So of course, as a researcher, you get into the project or into the research with certain biases or perhaps certain gaps in knowledge, but how do you deal with this? So one, I think it's highly important to reflect on your own positionality, your own identity from an intersectional perspective. So reflect on differences between you and narrators and potential biases you may have or knowledge gaps, but also power imbalances and how this might influence the study. So of course, reflection on your positionality is important for the entire process, from getting in touch with your respondents to interpreting the data and making conclusions, and all the other steps in between. Also, perhaps a good starting point, and I highlighted it here in the slides, is asking yourself the question, why are you actually undertaking this study? So what are your motives or your drivers? And of course, as I already highlighted, awareness here is important, but also thinking of ways to go a step further to prevent issues of misrepresentation, for example. And here you can think of finding ways to engage with the people you work with your narrators, checking data with them perhaps. Is this how they would like to be represented, or correct representation according to them? But also engaging with others in and outside of your field. And here peer feedback, of course, can be very useful. And this brings me to my third and final challenge, which relates to research fatigue, which of course means people being, there are people that are frequently approached by researchers, which affects their willingness to perhaps participate to studies. And this has been expressed by some people I've worked with, but also I've heard it from other researchers. So how can you deal with this? Because it is a serious topic and can really affect your project. So I have some tips of how to deal with this. I would highlight in this collaboration or co-creation. So find ways to collaborate with research participants in a more equal way in which they are also involved in the research process, but also find ways to establish better relationships with organizations, for example, NGOs, as they are often the ones that are overburdened. Are there ways to do something back, or perhaps volunteer, or offer some of your expertise as a researcher? And again, I would also like to highlight the importance of language. So what language are you publishing in? Will it reach those communities that you are working with? And are there ways to make it more accessible, perhaps? Also going beyond the limited academic bubble you might be in. So finding new creative ways to translate research insights, or as a way to reach more people, and in particular those that the research is about. And just with this, I would like to end. So I've shown how oral history allows us to transcend conventional historical accounts, offering space for more nuanced perspectives and untold stories, which is especially important when dealing with themes related to migration, which enables us to highlight different voices and challenge these one-sided or simplistic narratives, perhaps, and contribute to a more complete understanding of humans' lives in the past and the present. And of course, I've also highlighted some challenges that come with this discipline or with this method. But in the face of these complexities, we must emphasize collaboration and co-creation, ensuring that narrators are active contributors rather than passive subjects, and build meaningful relationships, offering reciprocity, and considering the accessibility of our research findings here is, of course, very important. And I would then like to end with let us not only broaden our understanding of this method, but also commit ourselves to ethical, inclusive, and transformative practices. So let oral history be a collective endeavor that contributes meaningfully to the lives of those we aim to represent and understand. Thank you.